Hello, my name is David Rogers and welcome aboard the former London fireboat Massey Shaw. Today it's April the 1st and we're going to be looking at an important part of our fire service history that happened today 75 years ago, and we're going to have a discussion about the National Fire Service and how it's affected and brought about the birth of the modern fire service as we know today. Joining me today, we have a well-known author on this and authority on the subject of fire services, and that's Bill Hickin. So welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
We're actually in the cruise space of Massey Shaw, which is a great place to be. And today we're going to be just asking Bill some questions and going through a process to look at how the current fire service, how its roots started in the National Fire Service back in its formation in 1941. During the course of our sessions, this will be the introduction piece. We'll be looking at other topics and other areas of the National Fire Service which are actually echoed in what happens in the modern fire service today. So starting off then, we're going to be looking at why the National Fire Service was required. So with Bill's help and knowledge, we're going to look at the background to the formation of the service in 1941. So Bill, how would you describe the state of the fire service with the auxiliary fire service from 1930s?
Yeah, well, I mean, up to 1938, believe it or not, the local authorities weren't obliged to maintain a fire brigade, although most did, but to varying degrees. The 1938 Fire Brigades Act made it compulsory. I should just say London was, on the 1865 Act, they were required to have a fire brigade, but nobody else was.
Okay.
So the 1938 Fire Brigades Act did make it a legal obligation. At that time, there was about 1,300 fire brigades in Britain, in Great Britain, England, Wales, and Scotland. They varied. Some were from the provincial cities, which were pretty good brigades, and some of the larger towns, down to small villages and rural areas, some of which left much wanting. What then happened, of course, with the war, the prospect of war, the government set up the auxiliary fire service, of which each brigade had its own AFS, but it was government funded and equipped. That led to a tenfold increase in the fire service.
Right.
Although, of course, they were all volunteers and they weren't mobilised at that point. However, when the war started in September 39, they were all mobilised. So at that point, they became largely full time, and it was about a 10-to-1 ratio to the existing regulars. Now, of course, as you know, there was the phony war period where there was a number of because there was nothing actually happening, certainly from a fire brigade point of view. Some of them drifted away.
Okay.
And then, of course, once the Blitz started in September 1940, everything changed almost overnight. And the problem was that while London was very well equipped and prepared and were able to handle the Blitz reasonably well, a lot of these other brigades had great difficulties. And once the Germans started bombing the provincial cities, Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, etc., Coventry, they were struggling, very much so in many cases. And of course, London and some of the other bigger brigades formed mobile columns to reinforce them. But when, of course, they arrived, they found that the whole setup, because you had so many small fragmented brigades, a fragmented setup, who was in command, equipment wasn't compatible. The particular one that's always cited, of course, is hose couplings.
Yes.
Different types of hose couplings. There was the reception for reinforcements and how they're going to be deployed. That wasn't clear. In fact, there were some instances where reinforcements went there and were actually returned, never actually got to work. So it really caused serious problems, and of course it meant that fires were getting away, getting out of control. I mean, eventually they were, of course, extinguished, but it could have gone a lot better, Anyway, this occurred a number of times, and because London was the biggest brigade, they were fairly well organised. Their columns, were fully integrated with canteens and support vehicles and command units and so on. Many of the senior fire officers in the service, but particularly in London, realised something had to be done because, of course, there was no guarantee that these raids just wouldn't keep continuing. Never ending sort of thing. So they decided that they've got to have a major organisation, preferably nationalisation. There were a number of politicians that also felt this, and they're in sort of Westminster and Whitehall. There was a lot of lobbying. Some felt, oh no, we can't do that; it's too radical. Others said we must do it. We're at war. Anyway, to cut a long story short, in the end, Herbert Morrison, the Home Secretary, he agreed that we'll go for full nationalisation.
Okay.
And that's what happened. And so in August the 18th, I think it was, 1941, the National Fire Service came into being. And this basically created a one single National Fire Brigade. And it absorbed all the existing regulars and auxiliaries. I mean, at that time, there were also some police fire brigades. They all went in as well. And then the service as a whole faced the daunting task of reorganising into a brand new service when the threat of air raids was still there. So it was a case of almost like swapping horses in midstream, and it was quite a what should we say? From a political standpoint, it was quite a serious decision. It could have gone wrong. But however it didn't. So that's basically how the NFS came about.
Well, thank you very much for that. What we need to look at, and perhaps explore some of the information you've given, because there were obviously, it went smoothly in the end, but there were some people who objected to the idea of losing their authority and power during this process.
That's right. The selection of officers was quite contentious in many areas because, of course, you had a chief officer of a small brigade. And under the new setup, he suddenly found himself. He was just, he was a station officer, quite lowly ranked. He was just in charge of one station, whereas he had been in charge of the brigade, albeit that brigade only had one station. And from the other point of view, some quite junior people were made up to relatively senior ranks because they'd had a lot of experience, particularly in London and some of the other cities. But yes, that was a contentious issue, officer selection, and yes, very much so. I mean, it settled down eventually, as these things tend to do. But at the time, it was quite controversial.
Sure, and obviously politically, it was a hot potato, and the fact that you've alluded to, that it could have gone badly wrong.
Yeah, I mean, had the race continued at a very high tempo while they were in this state of reorganisation, because from August, September, October, they were the critical months. But by October, they more or less got it sorted out. But it could have possibly gone wrong had there been really heavy raids. And but on the other hand, I mean, by that time, a lot of the people in the fire service had a lot of experience. There was a lot of goodwill, and hopefully, I'm sure they could have held it together. But it wouldn't have been an ideal situation. But of course, because the Germans turned on Russia, the Soviet Union, the raids reduced considerably. So they had a breathing space to do the reorganisation. Yeah.